Welcome to 31 Days of Halloween, Down the Red Rabbit Hole. I'm Michelle Davies. You may know some of my books, including Gone Astray, Wrong Place, False Witness, but I'm going down the red rabbit hole today to talk to you about my psychological thriller, Shadow of a Doubt, or more to the point, the real-life paranormal event that loosely inspired it. And that event was the Enfield Poltergeist. And what is so scary about the reason I am bringing this story to you today, because what is so scary about it is the research that I did for this book about the Enfield Poltergeist, which ended up being some of the most terrifying reading I've ever done. But first I'm going to start it was 2018, and I didn't have an idea for a book, and one morning I was listening to the radio, and it was Radio 4, Sue McGregor and the reunion show. And I don't know if you know of the show on Radio 4. It's basically where they take an event that happened years ago, and then they get some of the main players into the studio to kind of discuss what happened and you know, the impact it had and why it was a big news event. And that particular Sunday, it was the Enfield Poltergeist. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this story, it was late 70s. It was a very normal, very sort of nondescript house in North London, became the centre of this huge story, paranormal story involving the two teenage girls that lived there, but mostly one of them, Janet Hodgson, who was about 13, about to turn 14 at the time, and her older sister Margaret. And basically, all these strange things started happening in the house, like doors would open and close, you know, chairs would fly across the room, bits of furniture would fly across the room. And the family sort of got in touch with the police and the Daily Mirror newspaper. Now, I remember the story back then because my parents were avid Daily Mirror readers, and we used to get the paper delivered every day. And I remember my parents having this really heated debate about this, because my dad actually believes in the supernatural. He's done Ouija boards, and so he, you know, absolutely thought this must be happening. You know, the paper reporting it. Reporters were going into the house and seeing bits of Lego flying, like coming out of the ceiling, and when they picked them up, they'd be red hot, you know, and chairs would go across the room. The police witnessed chairs going across the room, you know, made reports of it. So definitely things were happening in this house, and it became this huge news story in the UK and beyond. And at the centre of it were these two girls, Janet and Margaret. But mostly, it seemed to be mostly happening to Janet. And, you know, in the end, they got called in paranormal investigators, which you know, that was something that the actual paper did, the Daily Mirror did, because they were just like, we don't know what this is going on. And the activity got worse. And so, you know, there are pictures of Janet being thrown out of bed. She was levitating. She reported one incident where a curtain was like noosed around her neck that she had no control over. You know, and then she started speaking in this voice, this very, very deep voice of a man, of a much older man. And the paranormal investigators, which included the now very famous Maurice Grosse, they made her, they were so sure that she must be projecting this voice that they, you know, because there was a lot about the girls must be faking this, that, you know, it's all been put on for the press. So they would do things like they made her take a sip of water, they would tape her mouth up, and then they would put a microphone at the front of her throat and a microphone at the back of her neck, and then they would record this voice coming out. And every time the voice would always be deeper from the back of her throat, meaning that she couldn't, even with the tape on, she could not be making that noise. So, as you can imagine, this was a really big story at the time. And so fast forward back to 2018, I'm listening to the radio, and they have some of the reporters, they have family members of the paranormal investigators who sadly passed away, talking about what happened. And then Sue McGregor said at the end that Janet and Margaret haven't really ever given interviews about it. I mean, they have made some appearances because there have been some sort of dramatisations of the Enfield Poltergeist. There was the Sky series that starred Timothy Spall. And then there's also been the Conjuring film that was based on the Enfield Poltergeist. So I'm reading this and I think, oh, that I just love that idea of, what happened now. It was like, what is the situation now with the girls? Because they didn't appear in the studio for the reunion, and Sue McGregor was telling the audience, the listeners, that I think they declined to give interviews, but she did have some basic recordings of where they said, it wasn't faked, it happened to them. Janet's very adamant as an adult that I know what happened. It was there. It happened to me. And I thought, okay, I really want to write a thriller sort of inspired by this. So my idea for Shadow of a Doubt, very different to the Enfield Poltergeist, but it basically involves a child who believes that a house has been haunted by an entity called Limey Stan, and the girl, Cara Belling, ends up being blamed for something that happens to her brother in the house, but she's like, it wasn't her, it was Slimy Stan, and so she ends up being separated from her family because of it. And then what happens, the novel starts in the present day when she's in her 30s and she finds out she's due to inherit the house where it all happened, and she has to go back for the first time in years. And as soon as she steps in the house, she thinks, he's still here, Limey Stan is still here, and he's still coming for me. And the reason I decided to go down that route was because while I was doing my research for the book, I obviously went down a rabbit hole about the Hodgson sisters, and what I wanted to know, what happened to them now. What were they doing? How were they living their lives? How did they get over this? What happened to the house? And it led me to a very excellent book called Will Storr versus the Supernatural. And I think the subheading is One Man's Journey to Prove Whether Ghosts Exist or something. Now, Will Storr is an amazing non-fiction writer. He's a fantastic writer who sort of decided, as a skeptic, he would go and investigate the paranormal. And at the start of the book, it's a brilliant book. If you're interested in paranormal, definitely go and read it. It's funny, but it's clever, it's emotional. And it starts with him going to Pennsylvania to meet some paranormal investigators there. And they take him to the house of a woman called, and I've written it down because I don't want to get it wrong, Kathy Gagnon. And she's this normal housewife, she's got a young family, there's her husband, but she is, for want of a better word, being possessed. So when she's at the house, at certain times in the house, she just gets taken over by this entity. So of course Will goes along, very sceptical, because at this point he's a non-believer, to witness this firsthand. And he's given the advice by the paranormal investigator he's with, like, don't set her off, because you'll know when she's gone under. And so they sit down in the kitchen, they begin the session, they're doing a seance to see what happens, and suddenly Will can see there's little orbs, little ghost orbs flying all over the place. So he's like, okay, this is really strange. And then he says a word, like, to express his shock at what he's seeing. And then suddenly, in the book, he says that he realises that Kathy is staring at him, except it doesn't look like Kathy staring at him. And he said, so how he says it is, I slowly became aware that Kathy is staring at me. This is it, I think. It's happened. I can feel it. The air is thick with it, tense, electric and snarling. Kathy has gone under. And then what happens next is him talking about how she leaves the room and how he's absolutely terrified. It's terrifying to read. But the reason I picked up the book was because as part of his paranormal research, he interviewed Janet Hodgson in Clacton-on-Sea, where she was living at the time he wrote the book. And he is one of the few people who has actually interviewed Janet now, all these years later, after the Enfield Poltergeist, to see what she's at. So I was really interested because my character, Cara Belling, was going to be that person years after the event. And it was really interesting because what Janet tells Will in the book, is that for years after she left home, and while her mum still lived in the house in Enfield, where it all happened, and where it had calmed down, or as far as everyone else was concerned, it had finished. They sent a priest in to perform an exorcism, and suddenly everything stopped, and all the press went away, and it all died down. But what Will says in the book is that up until Janet's mother died, and her brother was still living in the house with her mother, they were still experiencing things. They'd hear footsteps on the stairs, doors would open and close, but they didn't mind it, because compared to what they had been through in the 70s with the levitation, the whole constant, it went on for about 18 months non-stop, and the voice and the scary, so they thought they could just ignore it. And Janet said to Will, even my brother, until the day that he left that place after Mum died, he'd say, there's still something here. There's still something in this house. And Janet said to Will, she said, put it this way, it was like when you're in the house, it's like you're still being watched. So Will decides to ask her, do you ever feel like there is something with you still? Now, the way he describes Janet at the start of the interview is that she's very quiet. She watches you very intently. She was very composed. She's not, she was never one prone to being hysterical. That's why, as a child, it was almost like, what's this poor girl going through? Because it wasn't like, she wasn't, she was very quiet and kind of contained, and she was still like that as an adult. So then Will asks her, as I say, is there something still with you? To which she answers, sometimes. And he says she was speaking very softly, almost like reluctantly. And she said to him, I do feel like there's something with me. Nothing nasty though. And then she went, I can honestly say I'm not possessed. So at this point, Will's like, and then Will says, and I have to read this out as Will writes it. She looks at me, and then, with the wrecking ball of realisation almost knocking me through the window, I finally get who Janet reminds me of. It's Kathy Gagnon. So when Will was interviewing Janet and he asked her that question and she looked at him, he was suddenly reminded of the woman as she was being possessed in Pennsylvania. Anyway, I read this. I was absolutely terrified. Thinking, just the idea that it never really went away, that the press went away and the publicity went away, but the thing that caused the Enfield Poltergeist haunting never went away. So that's my scary story for this Halloween. As I say, loosely inspired my novel, Shadow of a Doubt. Very different though, very different. But yeah, scary.